Good evening to you. Welcome to the CNBC Africa special coverage of the Philips Get Us Back. But nonetheless, Dr. Harsha, has it all been about the pandemic for you as well? We've seen, unfortunately, that the ball has been dropped in other areas like HIV and making inroads around malaria. But just give us a sense of your reflection of the past 11 months and the key takeaways for you.
Sure. Good evening, Fifi, and thanks for the invitation for PHASA to be represented in your discussion this evening. Certainly, I think none of us can escape the fact that we've lived through a global pandemic. I think for me, the biggest shock was that it actually happened. We live in this globalized world with this amazing amount of technology. I think it's an era of the fourth technical revolution. And despite the advancements that we've made in time, we really have been vulnerable to this pandemic, which was very similar to the Spanish flu pandemic that occurred 100 years ago. So despite all these advances in every aspect of our life and society, us as human beings are still vulnerable to these micro threats. And I think it really emphasizes, one, our interconnectivity as human beings and as the global race. And also the fact that we have not paid attention to the basic determinants of health, speaking from my perspective in the health sector. I personally have been involved with the COVID response in Gauteng, so it really has taken over my world specifically. And yeah, I think what we've learned is that through this pandemic, initially we had to respond to something unexpected, and I think it did take us by surprise. I think in South Africa, we were a bit fortunate because it occurred in other countries first. I remember watching with shock and fear what was happening in Italy in April last year and thinking this could never happen to us. But if you compare the extent of our third COVID wave to what happened there, it was so comparable. But at that point in time, we really didn't expect to face those circumstances. But I think overall, despite it being a pandemic, in terms of how we needed to respond and the impact on our health services, we really faced familiar challenges despite doing this during unfamiliar circumstances of a global pandemic. But I think in terms of what we needed to do, it really was calling out for the basic healthcare responses that do exist, but were not up to the capacity that we needed it to be at. And I think for South Africa and many countries specifically, the health inequity is a huge problem. And as Dr. Chris spoke about the national health insurance before, our move to providing universal health coverage really is what we need to address that.
Feel free to make any comments from what you have heard from Dr. Shakira, but just your take and your view on the generational divide and whether it's something that we need to heed to right now and ensure that it is not an issue for us further down the line.
Sure. Well, overtly, I would hope that we don't have a generational divide. I think we have generational differences in terms of different life perspectives and maybe even needs and understandings and contexts. But I really hope that at this point in time, we can't define it as a generational divide because, especially as, let's reflect on what COVID has taught us, we really are interdependent. We're interdependent on everybody, including all different age categories. I think you spoke about the age categorization with the vaccination, and this really speaks to equity and solidarity, social solidarity, which is a premise of the NHI bill as well. So we treat those who are most in need of healthcare first, and the vaccine program really was prioritized based on the highest risk groups. And what we saw in South Africa and in overseas countries was that the older age groups were more vulnerable to death, and the vaccines really protected against severe illness and death. And in a resource-constrained environment, I think this was the best approach to inform our vaccine strategy, and that's why you saw the over 60s being vaccinated first. And I think if we had a generational divide, we would have had young people protesting at this at the outset of the vaccine campaign, but we don't have that because I think we do understand that we really are one society and everybody, we need to work together to really take care of each other. But that being said, I'm sure there are certain issues within all age categories that the health services may need to work harder in terms of addressing the needs. And we do need to really make people sensitized to the avenues and channels for giving feedback to the health system, because if these needs exist and it's not actually fed back to the system can't respond. And yeah, so I think my reflection on that would be, if these right now, I don't identify them explicitly, but if they do exist, I think we must certainly address different generational needs.
All right.
Thanks.
All right.